Imagine signing a peace agreement that ensures peace, stopping violence, rebuilding trust, and establishing a better future. Then imagine the exact same peace agreement becoming a time bomb, planting seeds of resentment, motivating spoilers, and undermining justice. Behind all the announcements of victory and statements of hope or optimism lies an old dynamic as old as diplomacy. Peace agreements have appalling unforeseen consequences, planting seeds for additional conflict. Peace is never smooth, with hearts being hardened on the battlefields. Peace talks unveil agendas, weaknesses, and power imbalances of countries. Governments and factions also collide with treaties out of fatigue or external pressure rather than reconciliation. Timeless examples reverberate across continents. Versailles and Locarno treaties promised eternal peace, but on autocratic terms have fostered hatred, economic collapse, revanchism, and eventually a fresh war. Remember Versailles. Germany bore all the burden and crippling reparations. Politicians like Clemenceau warned it might be an armistice for 20 years good enough. Resentment provided Hitler fertile soil in which to grow. Cut to. Treaties intended to stabilize Europe only provided fertile soil for war and extremism. Even the Locarno treaties, intended to shore up Versailles, fell apart when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland. Only craven diplomatic disapproval was the reaction. Why? Because peace deals never reach substance. They might redefine borders, demand war reparations, or set deadlines, but never bring themselves near to entrenched grievances. They reduce complex stories into paragraphs of stale legal prose without mending ancient wounds or offering justice. Treaties thus become superficial band-aids that impose shallow peace upon festering suspicion. That ambiguity is rich ground for spoilers. Spoilers are the players who politic or undermine peace using treaties. Peacemakers refer to them as spoilers, belligerents who profit from prolonged war, politicians, warlords, extremist groups who employ violence or threat to undermine agreements. When spoiling occurs, treaties are no longer guarantees but can become tools of war. Violence comes back. Peace is painstakingly worked on and ruthlessly undermined. Even spoiler-free, multilateral or bilateral agreements can be abused by hegemonic signers. They might bully weaker allies, license hierarchies in world affairs, justify sovereignty in the gesture of rejecting human rights, or maintain post-colonial order. International law professed to be value-free and universal is accused of assigning meaning to realities of geopolitics. Hegemonic powers selectively apply norms or ignore them to cancel treaties and institutions in the process. Worst of all is negative peace academics' description of peace built up through the absence of war but not through justice or conciliation. Peace settlements may freeze conflict without building trust on both sides, or short other deeper social needs, and even the inadvertent institutionalization of instability. Insufficient cessation but not durable peace. In short, treaties can fail in 4 key ways: punishing the defeated too harshly, ignoring spoilers, enshrining power imbalances, and settling for negative peace. And as we'll explore in the following parts, these failures lead to underdevelopment, environmental injustice, legal erosion, and lost opportunity for sustainable harmony. The dark side of peace isn't myth, it's woven into the pages of treaties throughout history. Let's talk about Colombia. In 2016, following more than half a century of brutal war between Colombia's government and FARC guerrillas, the world applauded what appeared to be a historic victory. A peace deal celebrated as progressive, ambitious, even worthy of a Nobel Prize. On paper, it promised disarmament, development in rural areas, justice for victims, and political integration for former combatants. But behind the pomp and ceremony, a familiar pattern that had followed over and over before again repeated itself. The crack showed right away. The ratification referendum fell short of its initial estimate by the narrowest of margins. Why? Because too many Colombians perceived the treaty to be too soft on FARC leaders, political integration without adequate punishment for the type of crime they committed, like kidnapping, murder, and drug sales. Others were left out, their grievances brushed aside in the name of expediency. And here's where one of the worst issues with peace deals comes to light. When elites have backroom negotiation, the average man feels disenfranchised, and social acceptance declines. Despite the government reapproving and redoing the deal in Congress, it didn't pass. Disarming former FARC fighters in order to reincorporate them was not possible. Hyped-up rural reforms fell behind. Armed groups took up space in vacant territories. And, for example, hundreds of social leaders, activists, and former guerrillas were killed over the next years. In short, the peace agreement silenced public war but drove other forms of violence and insecurity into the jungle. This is not Colombian in itself. Everywhere on Earth, peace deals inked under international pressure never ever control bullets but change of structure. Governments accept peace deals as political triumphs, checking boxes for foreign aid or media attention, but not necessarily halting repression or building trust. And the Earth pays for it. Treaties in most post-conflict regions completely rule out environmental management. Trees, rivers, and wildlife historically susceptible to crossfire are left unchecked. In a bitter irony, peace sometimes leaves destruction in its wake. In Colombia's Amazonian rainforest, deforestation accelerated after FARC withdrew because illegal mining, land grabbing, and ranching were left unchecked. Peace, it appears, doesn't always mean protection either for humans or Earth. And then there's always the case of frozen conflicts. Consider Cyprus, where negotiations have been frozen for decades since the island split in 1974. There are ceasefires, but real peace, freedom of movement, justice, reunification isn't on. Abstinence from war is a myth of stability when there are profound divisions and lingering grievances bubbling beneath. Even the Middle East has its horror stories. Oslo Accords between the Palestinians and Israel were intended to be the beginning of a blueprint to everlasting peace. 2 decades later, though, accords are accused of perpetuating imbalanced power dynamics, partitioning Palestinian land, and doing nothing to prevent settlement expansion. Sporadic violence erupts, innocent civilians get hurt, and prospects for a two-state solution become ever more remote. In the eyes of others, Oslo was never a step toward peace but a diplomacy trap that legitimized occupation under the guise of negotiations. The lesson is painful but definite. A human hand on paper does not still doubt, erase inequality, or heal wounds. When treaties are politics more than persons in trenches, or when they fail to remedy injustices, peace is shallow, transient, and sometimes dangerous. The world continues to play this game, from Asia to Africa, at its own peril. The more you delve into international peace deals, the more you realize how much power politics was employed to get them done rather than ideals. Behind all the smiley faces and the handshake, there's always an evil game, a game where the power brokers write the rules and the powerless have to get on board for peace's sake. Consider the 1995 Dayton Agreement that concluded the genocidal Bosnian War. It might have concluded the war at the surface level and declared Bosnia an independent state. But remove the veneer, and you find a grotesquely dysfunctional system, married to ethnic cleavages, political gridlock, and repressive foreign domination. The agreement delineated Bosnia's internal boundaries on ethnic lines, sanctifying division instead of unity. Bosnia remains to struggle with political deadlock, nationalism, and a seriously muddled system of government, some argue, that makes it vulnerable and fragmented. This is what happens when peace accords are built less to solve the roots of conflict, but more to contain them. Sometimes they turn out to be a tool by which more macro geopolitics gain areas of influence. Western powers crave quick stability in the Balkans, not necessarily reconciliation at depth. In Bosnia, they therefore built a peace that ended conflict, yet did not cure the society. We find it elsewhere as well. Peace agreements are usually the work of the world's superpowers, not those most directly involved. The 1953 Korean armistice had in fact ended fighting in the Korean War but permanently divided the peninsula, militarily equipped it, and placed it in a state of constant tension. Why? For as the greater Cold War agreements between America, Russia, and China dwarfed the conditions of that armistice more than Koreans themselves in actual terms had to demand, North and South Korea are technically still at war today, mired in diplomatic purgatory to the advantage of other powers but to the disadvantage of millions trapped in the wartime shadow. Even economic interests into peace agreements. Post-conflict periods are also good for foreign companies, natural resource looting, and reconstruction contracts. It should be noted that the agreements come with foreign investment prospects in tow after economic discrepancies led to conflict in the first place. Post-conflict mineral concessions, land grabbing, and development in disguise as a cover have introduced new grievances for people in some African countries. And selective justice. In some cases, to achieve peace negotiators offer amnesties to war criminals or militias in return for peace, trading justice for stability. The argument is hard but ancient. Punish too harshly, and you put to labor waging war once more. Forgive too readily, and you erode confidence in the rule of law. But history teaches us that if justice is sacrificed on the altar of politics, the final credibility of peace will be lost. The abuses go unchecked, the victims are cheated, and the cycle of violence smolders in the background, waiting to be ignited once more. World peace deals are likely to overpromise and underdeliver since they initially operate in the interests of the great powers, conceal unpleasant realities, and trade justice for a bargaining windfall. The result: a world of insecure, negotiated, or incomplete peaces that may stand in the short term but never actually be secure. Maybe the most underreported consequence of peace agreements anywhere in the world is that they quietly fast-track displacement and inequality even as they guarantee stability. It's cynical but an international pattern in post-conflict societies everywhere. When a treaty is signed, there usually is a rush to begin. Governments are set up, donors pour in with offers of assistance, and rebuilding is underway. So doing, however, pushes marginalized peoples to the periphery. Their land is taken, their voices muffled, and their misery quietly brushed under the mat in the name of peace. Ironically, it is those war-tormented societies which also still suffer in peace but without a lens pointed in their direction anymore because the world believes the crisis has passed. The best example of this is in Sudan. After decades of brutal North-South Sudanese civil war, the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement was hailed as a milestone. It subsequently led to the independence of South Sudan in 2011. However, peace did not yield prosperity and justice. Instead, Sudan and independently new South Sudan both became mired in a cycle of violence, internal displacement, and corruption. Elites from South Sudan grabbed power, the wealth was looted, and the ordinary people already traumatized by war were impoverished, made insecure, and displaced to camps. This uncovers a bitter truth. Elite power-sharing deals, without economic justice and social equality, won't work or result in slippery, unstable states. Poverty, ethnic competition, exclusion are causes aren't eliminated just because leaders extend hands. And if war elites who are corrupt are the same to order peace, regular citizens barely notice difference. Forced displacement is also an unmanifest expense. Sometimes peace accords redistribute borders or create demographic reshuffling that dislocates individuals. In the Balkans, after the Dayton Accords, there were thousands of displaced persons who were unable to go back to their hometown because of persistent hostility, political barriers, or lack of infrastructure. In Israel-Palestine, endless cycles of despairing peace talks have yielded no solution for Palestinian refugees, with entire generations frozen in limbo in Lebanese, Syrian, and Jordanian camps of exile. And don't overlook the cost to the environment, less discussed but perhaps disastrous. Peace processes will have the tendency to return available post-war land to return to instant exploitation, logging, mining, drilling for petroleum in the name of development. But it normally damages sensitive environments, displaces indigenous populations, and creates new social tensions. Colombia's Amazonian rainforest face an invasion of land and forest grabbing following the peace agreement with FARC. Post-conflict natural resource arrangements in Africa, especially in the Congo Basin, have led to environmental degradation and human rights abuse. It's easy to sell peace as a neat respite from war savagery, but the world's not that neat. Unintended, discriminatory, and irresponsible, peace deals can end up rooting injustice, uprooting people, and sowing fresh chaos. The terrible irony is that the treaties that are supposed to stop suffering extended in other, not so obvious forms. It is perhaps the most dangerous fallacy regarding peace treaties that short-term peace is equal to everlasting peace. History always proves once more that whenever peace treaties are sought with an eye to short-term peace but in disregard of real justice, they plant seeds for some ultimate war much more ferocious and ruinous than its predecessor. Worst of all, perhaps, is the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I. We are always told of the punishing clauses to which Germany was subjected, the lost territory, and the revolting war guilt clause. Not so frequently discussed is how Germany's punishment provisions did not simply shame a nation, but gave the very fertile ground upon which radical ideologies could take root. Economic ruin, political upheaval, and bruised national pride brought Hitler to power, and ultimately to World War II. It's the final lesson in how to employ peace within literature as fuel for an even greater fire. By not confronting the root cause, by refusing reconciliation to punishment, Versailles guaranteed the so-called peace would be a temporary thing. Flash forward to today, and we have the same omens. In Afghanistan, continued attempts at peace agreements with such factions as the Taliban were to bracket U.S. military involvement and not create permanent control or human rights guarantees. When the U.S. entered into the Doha Agreement in 2020, individuals greeted it as a path to peace. But it left out the Afghan government from significant negotiations. The result, the abrupt collapse of the Afghan state in 2021, the Taliban's return to power, and humanitarian disaster. Moral of the tale: peace deals without listening to voices in the neighborhood and geopolitics at the expense of long-term settlement on a far-reaching scale are sure to fail. In fact, they have the operational consequence of disappointing precisely the people whom they nominally save. There's also the problem of selective enforcement of peace. Powerful nations prefer to promote agreements that are to their strategic advantage and ignore others that aren't. There has been extensive international attempts at brokering in oil-endowed, mineral-endowed, or strategically positioned territories, while other conflicts such as the long-standing Yemeni conflict or ethnically motivated violence in Myanmar receive minimal international pressure or weakly enforced agreements. This two-pronged standard also works to leach faith in peacemaking and also demonstrate how treaties are all about display but not content. Politicians across the globe would wish to be seen as peacemakers, but without commitment to justice, equality, and human dignity, peace has no meaning. Even as the decades go by and treaties hold, festering sores of unsoothed grievance can simmer beneath. Northern Ireland's Good Friday Agreement is a beacon of achievement, yet tensions seethe. The factions remain mostly apart, sectarian distrust lingers, and political standoff habitually immobilizes government. The peace has endured but only by continuing to stand in a tense standoff and never actually mending hard divides. That is the dark side of peace treaties. They are legitimate, but they are not silver bullets. Short of reconciliation with injustice, displacement, historical trauma, and justice, treaties are temporary band-aids on an open wound. They silence guns, but never muzzle resentment. If the world truly desires enduring peace, it must have signatures and not responsibility, universality, environmental concern, and above all, the will to confront repulsive realities. Anything less, and the next treaty on our docket may be the calm before the next storm.